Hi, this is Becky Spain with your lecture on Chapter 3 for Business Communication. The book we're using is Excellence in Business Communication, and Chapter 3 covers communication challenges in a diverse global marketplace. Once again, I'll allow you to read through the learning objectives on your own, but let's start with learning objective number 1, which is to discuss the opportunities and challenges of intercultural communication. Each of our cultural backgrounds influence almost every aspect of how we communicate, and our cultural differences are among the most common barriers to actually having a successful communication with someone else. However, these differences can also enrich our communications with each other. It can enrich our decision-making processes, and it can also enrich other aspects of how we do business by bringing a broader range of our life experiences and our life perspectives to the table. However, it's our job to make sure that we are guiding the communication process in a way that minimizes communication barriers and maximizes the benefits of having all of the value of diversity at the table. Having a proactive approach to diversity and inclusiveness pays off in multiple ways for each of us, from having richer life experiences to helping our company to improve their bottom line profits, and also helps with employee satisfaction and employee engagement. So let's look at the advantages of a diverse workforce. Oftentimes when we think of diversity, we think of it in terms of what is our ethnic background, but a broader definition of diversity includes all characteristics and all experiences that define each of us as individuals. And these include the list of things such as our race, our age, it can include our military experience, our parental status, our marital status, and even our thinking style. These characteristics and experiences actually have a profound effect on the way that we communicate personally and also in our business environment. When you're part of a diverse workforce, it can actually help you to have a broader range of views and ideas as you come together to look at products, projects, and business opportunities, and it also helps with the understanding of the diverse markets that you're serving. Intercultural communication is the process of sending and receiving messages between peoples whose cultural backgrounds could lead them to interpret verbal and nonverbal signs differently. Every attempt that we make to send and also to receive messages is influenced by culture. So to communicate successfully, we need a basic grasp of the cultural differences that we may encounter in the marketplace, and then also how we should handle them. Though it's a given that in intercultural communication there's going to be language barriers, we also need to think about the fact that there's going to be differences in regard to our nonverbal cues and the misunderstanding of how we use specific words. And even as we mentioned briefly during our discussion on Chapter 2, even how close that you stand to a person or how far away you stand can differ with different cultures. Learning objective number 2 is to define culture, explain how culture is learned, and define ethnocentrism and stereotyping. Developing cultural competency is critical because chances are pretty good that at some point in your career you're going to be working across international borders, and then also not only across international borders, but also your office will most likely have a very diverse workforce, and the people who are working with you are going to bring different cultural competencies with them as well. So improving your cultural communication skills could make you more valuable as a job candidate, and then also as you're climbing the corporate ladder or whatever career ladder that you have at every stage. It can make you more valuable as an employee. So let's begin by looking at culture. So culture is a shared system of symbols, beliefs, attitudes, values, expectations, and norms for behavior. Actually, you belong to several cultures, not only from the country that you live in, but then also from different cultural groups that you're a part of, whether that's an ethnic group, a religious group. There's a long list of the different parts of your life that influence your culture and who you are. You're already an expert in your own native culture, which is positive because you understand how your culture works and how people are expected to communicate. But it is also potentially negative because your communication habits are based on your own culture, so you rarely think about how culture influences you. An important step towards successful intercultural communication is becoming more aware of the rules imposed by your own culture and how those rules influence your communication. Your cultural background influences the way that you prioritize what you see as being important in your life and how you define your attitude toward what is appropriate in a given situation. It also is the establishment of rules of behavior. Cultures are automatic. That is that we learn cultures directly or indirectly from other members of our group, whether they're explicitly told which behaviors are acceptable or whether you learn by observing which values work best in a particular group. And cultures tend to be complete, meaning that they provide most of their members with most of the answers to life's big questions. So take a second and stop and think about this question. Do you consider yourself to be the same culture as your parents or other close family members? And if not, what differences do you perceive and why? We tend to be more comfortable around people who have similarities or who have cultures that are similar to our own. So some of the challenges of working in a diverse workforce is understanding the effects of how bringing all of these different cultures together can impact the working environment and especially communication and how you can communicate with one another. We often bring our own biases into the workplace and we don't even realize that they are biases. So let's look at a couple of terms that the book talks about, ethnocentrism and stereotyping. So ethnocentrism is the tendency to judge all other groups according to our standards, beliefs, behaviors, and customs. So my way is the right way, and that's pretty typical. We usually do think that, but we need to recognize that and make sure that we're not using that as the standard and judging others as being wrong because they don't do things the way that we do them. It may be more comfortable for you, but that doesn't mean that it's always the right way, and opening yourself up to what are other groups' standards and behaviors and customs will open your world of understanding and improve your communication abilities. Now, stereotyping is similar in that you're assigning generalized attributes to an individual on the basis of membership in a particular group. So let's say that I'm stereotype people who have tattoos, and I think everybody who has a tattoo doesn't have a job. I'm taking a commercial that I saw the other day that was a joke that if you have a tattoo you must not work. I'd never heard that before, but we'll use that as an example. So if I stereotype by saying, well, everyone who has a tattoo must not have a job or must not have a good job, that's a belief that I have, that I'm assigning that general characteristic to everyone that's in that group. We have a tendency to do that a lot of times based on age. Well, that's an older person, so they don't understand technology. Or that's a younger person, so they certainly can't do a good job on this project because they don't have the experience that an older person would bring to the table. So those are stereotyping, and we need to make sure that we're not projecting our thoughts about specific groups of people and projecting it onto all people of that group. We can work to overcome ethnocentrism and stereotyping by avoiding making assumptions about all individuals, avoiding judgments, and acknowledging distinctions. Overcoming these biases is not a simple task, even when we're highly motivated to do so, but the best thing to do is to become aware and then start working toward eliminating those biases. Our learning objective number 3 is to explain the importance of recognizing cultural variations and list 8 categories of cultural differences. So the first cultural difference that we're going to look at is cultural context. Cultural context is the pattern of physical cues, environmental stimuli, and implicit understanding that convey meaning between two members of the same culture. To convey meaning in a high context culture, which would include Japanese, Chinese, Greek, Arab, Mexican, Spanish, people of these cultures tend to rely less on verbal communication and more on context of nonverbal actions and the environmental setting to convey meaning. In a high context culture, the primary role of communication is around building relationships rather than exchanging information. And then the opposite side of this, of course, is low context cultures, which includes the United States and other cultures such as Germany, England, Canada, Scandinavia, France. In these cultures, people tend to rely more on verbal communication and less on circumstances and cues. In a low context culture, our primary role of communication is exchanging information. I'm sure it's easy to see how we could have conflict in our communication whenever you have someone who's in a low context culture, such as in the United States, trying to do business with someone who's in a high context culture, such as maybe Japan. If the person that you're trying to do business with in Japan is more focused on the primary role of communication being around building the relationship and not around exchanging information, you're going to have issues because your primary role is around communication and exchanging information. So let's say that you're trying to do business with someone from Japan and you are bringing your culture from the United States with you. You're going to want to get right down to exchanging information and how you're doing business. If you're there to come to an agreement on how a product is going to be provided or a price or an order for services, you're going to want to get right down to that and get right to business. But the person that you're trying to do business with comes from a culture where that's not the most important thing, and they don't want to do business with you at all or know what you have to offer until they have a chance to build a relationship with you. So you can see how you can have cultural context conflict right off of the bat just simply by whether or not you're doing business with someone who is in a low context culture or a high context culture. So people from a low context culture tend to value the written word. If we write it down, we agree on it, it's a contract, it's legal, it's binding. We consider anything that is written and signed to be binding, and this is what we're going to do. And we view laws as being very strict. We're going to do business to the letter of the law. But people who are in high context cultures don't see it that way. They put less emphasis on the written word, and whenever a contract is signed, it really more means that I'm making an agreement to do business with you rather than here are all the specific details of how we're going to do business. And they consider a personal pledge to have more value than a written contract. So they view laws with more flexibility. Once again, I'm sure you can see how when you're traveling and you're working with individuals, or you're not traveling, if you're just working with individuals that are from a high context culture and you are from a low context culture, how there's going to be some difficulties that are going to arise just in trying to organize and consider how you're going to do business with one another. So our learning objective was to look at the 8 categories of cultural differences. This gives us those 8 categories. We've already discussed cultural context, and next we're going to look at legal and ethical differences. And actually I got ahead of myself because what I just shared about low context cultures valuing the written word and considering written agreements of binding and going strictly by law compared to high context cultures who put less emphasis on contracts and view law as more flexibility. That is the point of the legal and ethical differences. Sorry, got ahead of myself there. Okay, so now let's look at social customs. So in regard to social customs, some behavioral rules are formal and are specifically articulated, such as table manners, where others are informal and are learned over time. So our social customs can vary from culture to culture, and they can affect such areas as what is proper etiquette, what are manners, how do we look at time. People who are in high context cultures often see time as being more flexible, while those of us who are in the United States see time as a way to plan our business day and use time to schedule ourselves so that we can be most productive. It's kind of interesting to learn that really people in the United States are pretty much on the far end of the scale in regard to time. And we have everything scheduled, and everything is on a schedule from when we go to class to when class is over, and when church starts and when church is out, where people from high context cultures are much more concerned about relationship building and not nearly as concerned about time. So I've had some dealings with people that are in Latin countries, and they have a totally different attitude towards time. And when you go to a meeting, the meeting may be scheduled for 3 o'clock, but it may start at 3 o'clock, and it may start at 3:30, and it may start at 4 o'clock. It'll start when everybody gets there, and everybody will get there whenever they are finished building the relationships with the people that they've come across in the day. So if you're on your way to a meeting that starts at 3 o'clock and you run into someone that you need to talk to just in regard to relationship building, you take the time to have that conversation, and you don't worry about the fact that the meeting's going to start at 3 o'clock. Well, those of us who are in the United States, that drives us absolutely crazy. We're incredibly time focused. The meeting starts at 3 and is over at 4. We start at 3, we're over at 4. So I'm sure that you can see just in this one element how there can be conflict between the different cultures, and this is just one of the social customs to be discussed. Let's move on to nonverbal communication. The book gives an interesting example about the simplest hand gestures may have different meanings in different cultures, and then it talks about a gesture that communicates good luck in Brazil is equivalent to giving somebody the finger in Colombia. So being aware of those types of differences with your nonverbals can help you to have better communication skills. I know that in some cultures, shaking the head yes does not necessarily mean yes. It could just mean I heard you, but it doesn't necessarily mean I agree with you. So nonverbal communication can be as different from country to country as any other thing that we've been talking about, and something that we don't often think about. It seems like if you raise your hand in a hand gesture that it should mean the same thing everywhere, or shaking your head yes or no should mean the same everywhere, but that's just simply not the case. The next category that we'll look at is age differences, and I really find this incredibly fascinating because of all the different generations that are currently in the workplace. Some workplaces actually have people from all 5 generations in the workplace at one time. So we have the radio generation, also sometimes called the greatest generation, the baby boomers, Generation X, Generation Y, and Generation Z. Now, the book lists some characteristics that are typically assigned to each of these groups, as well as the age or the time range on each of those. It should be noticed that there's no general agreement on generations as to when the generations start and when they end. Like for the baby boomers, I've seen from 46 to 64, but I've also seen like from 46 to 60. So they can vary depending on whose analysis that you're looking at. And also it's important to note that whenever they say like baby boomers have characteristics that are X, Y, and Z, that basically means that because of the things that were going on when the baby boomers were born and being raised, that these are things that influence how they see the world. And so they're basically taking generalities and pushing them together and saying these things happened which were critical to the development of people who were born during this time, therefore they see the world this way, which differs from a different generation that those things were not going on, so they see the world in a different way. I hope that makes sense. I really find that generational conflicts in the workplace to be amazingly interesting, and I could actually do an entire lecture just on that, but we won't do that today since I want to stay focused on covering this chapter with you. The next category is gender differences. This is another area that I'm sure you can guess that I'm very passionate about, and could also do an hour-long lecture just on this one topic. But the perceptions of men and women in business vary, not only from the different perceptions of men viewing women in the workplace, women viewing men in the workplace, but it also varies from culture to culture. Gender bias can range from overt discrimination to subtle and sometimes even unconscious beliefs based on, once again, how we were raised, what's our culture. It's also interesting to note the percentage of management roles held by men increases steadily the further one looks up the corporate ladder. So where entry-level positions, there might be a fairly even mixture of men and women holding those positions. As you climb higher up the corporate ladder, the disparity becomes greater, and men hold more managerial positions than women do. And unfortunately, that's just a result of where we are in our viewpoints towards gender, though we're doing a lot to break those some of those assumptions. It's also interesting to note that men and women tend to have different communication styles somewhat, where men have a tendency to emphasize outcomes and content in their communication. Women have a tendency to place a higher premium on relationships, which of course then you can see how that might help when women are dealing with people from different cultures. Then we might have more sensitivity there than men do. So the better thing to look at is to identify that whether you're male or female, the characteristics that you bring to an organization or to a team have their own strengths, and they should be valued. Individuals should be valued for the strengths that they bring to the team rather than what their gender is. The book hits gender differences pretty briefly, and will do the same. It's one of those topics that you never want to talk about at a business meeting. And even in a business class, it can get a little touchy from time to time. But a person's religion is one of the most personal and sometimes influential aspects of their life. And there's lots of opportunity for controversy and conflict in the workplace setting. Employers will continue to struggle with what attention that they give towards people's in their specific religious beliefs, and then also how they can recognize those within a workplace, because my religious beliefs may be exactly opposite than your religious beliefs, and so it becomes difficult to honor both your beliefs and my beliefs in a workplace. And yet who we are in our religious beliefs is a really critical part of our beliefs and our culture for many of us. So I'm sure that you can see how this can be a difficult topic, and a difficult topic to address as a business. And then finally, we have ability differences. Both colleagues and customers with physical or cognitive disabilities that affect communication represent another important aspect of our diversity picture. We can often use assistive technologies to help people with disabilities to be able to interact with computers and colleagues. I know when I was a manager with Bank One that we had an employee who had a vision disability, and they could see, but they were legally blind, and so we had to get special assistive technologies to help them to be able to see the screens that they were using to assist customers, so that the words were all really huge on the screen, but they were able to do the job with the assistance of specific technology. And though the book doesn't address it, I'll just put a little side note, a rabbit note here, that when you're working with ability differences, you also need to consider the workplace environment and how we need to adjust the workplace environment so that people with disabilities can function within that. So I know that one of the things that I did one time, I was moving some boxes, and I just took them and shoved them outside my office into the hallway, and then I was going to go get a cart and move them later in the day. And someone came by and said, "You do realize that you have somebody on your team who is legally blind, though they can see some shapes, with assistance. They're not going to be able to see that you have put boxes in the hallway, and it's possible that they could trip over them." And I just had never thought about that. So in addition to what we can do with assistive technologies, we also need to make sure that we're being considerate of people who have disabilities and how they have to function within the world that we physically function within, and make sure that you're making adjustments and considering them in those things as well. On to learning objective number 4, list 4 general guidelines for adapting to business culture. And at this point in the lecture, we've covered some of this already, so we'll just kind of fly through some of this. But just in general, be aware of your own biases. Realizing that you have biases is the first step to starting to address some of the biases that you have in your life. The book also talks about being cautious about applying the golden rule, because the golden rule is to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And the book talks about the fact that sometimes what someone wants is not what you want. So you need to consider not necessarily what you would do or you would have people do to you, but what would be the best thing for them. So thinking about the golden rule in regard to what's the best thing for that person. The next slide looks at guidelines for adapting to U.S. business culture. These items are listed on page 79, and I'm going to let you read through these at your leisure. If you're a recent immigrant to the United States, or if you grew up in a culture outside the U.S. mainstream, it would be worth your time to read through these and to become familiar with those, because they will help you. Learning objective number 5, identify 7 steps you can take to improve your intercultural communication skills. Say that 3 times fast. So this chart is on page 80 of your book, and it gives you components of successful intercultural communication. You can improve your intercultural skills throughout your career by studying other cultures and studying other languages, learning to respect preferences for communication styles, learning to write and speak clearly, learning to listen carefully, and knowing when to use interpreter or translators to help you get your message across to the audience that you have. When learning about other cultures, you don't need to learn about the whole world at once. You can learn, you also don't need to learn everything about a culture. Just even small amounts of research will help you to grasp the bigger picture. And there's lots of ways to learn about other cultures. Of course, there's lots of websites that can help you with that, books, magazines, newspapers, and also check with your company's HR department. They may very well have training programs for you that they can send you through modules or classes to help you to understand how to communicate better across different cultures. And I think, too, that your HR department would be interested to see that you are putting forth the effort to learn more about successful intercultural communication. The book also outlines some tips for writing for multilingual audiences, such as using plain language and using clear examples. Make sure that you avoid slang and jargon. Don't, once again, abbreviate words or use things that you would normally use within texting, because that will be very confusing to a multilingual audience. Make sure that you cite numbers carefully, and use transitions between your thoughts to help your reader follow along, or your audience follow along. The book goes through some examples on starting on page 83, and rather than going through this line by line, this is something that you should probably sit down and take a few minutes and review these examples. It will help you with your homework assignment as well. And then finally, speaking with multilingual audiences. So our languages vary considerably in the significance of tone, our pitch, our speed, our volume. All of these create challenges for people trying to interpret the explicit meaning of words for themselves. So as the speaker, you should adjust your content of your message and the style of your delivery to accommodate the needs of your listener. Once again, this goes back to audience-based. Who is your audience, and what do you need to do to be able to communicate with them from where they are? Make sure that you're speaking clearly and simply, and look for feedback. Rephrase as needed, but make sure that you've completed your thought before you do that. When working with people from other cultures that speak different languages, it's not necessary always to learn the language, and learning the language is not something that you're going to do in a short amount of time, but you can still make points with the people that you're working with by learning common greetings and key phrases in their language, and then using those to greet them. It really shows a sign of respect, that you care about them and that you're interested in their language and in speaking to them in their language. And it makes a really big, it's a big point for you whenever you are working with individuals who speak different languages. And one last point before we bring this lecture to a conclusion. The book talks about it. It's not outlined in the PowerPoint, but I did want to talk a little bit about technology and using technology for translation. So we had some people come and stay with us this summer from Mexico, and the man spoke English very well, but his wife did not. Now, we've met them several times. We've been in their home in Mexico, and they've been in ours before. And speaking with the woman, because she didn't speak English, is always presented a difficulty. And we normally had to wait for her husband to translate, and we could tell by how short some of his translations were that he wasn't necessarily always translating everything. So we went to modern technology to help us with that as she visited this time, and we actually used Google Translation, which was amazing because not only could we speak words in and then it would speak it to her in Spanish, but she could speak back in Spanish and it would speak back to us. You could use a conversational format, and it would just automatically do it back and forth, and it allowed us to communicate with one another. We also found that when we went to Pearl Harbor and also when we went to church, that there was a function of Google Translator that actually allows you to use the camera ability, and we'd put the camera over the words in English, and it would change the picture for her to words in Spanish. So she could actually read all of the words at Pearl Harbor. She could read the scripture at church and the words for our songs. And I had never used that technology before. And if you have not, I encourage you to just take a few minutes and play with Google Translator. It's a free app, and see what you can do in regard to translation. It's really amazing. And if you have someone that you're either working with or it's in your life personally that speaks a different language, I highly recommend using that as a tool. So with that concludes our lecture on Chapter 3, and I look forward to talking with you again as we look at Chapter 4.